Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the March Lunch and Learn. I'm Chris Judge. I'm your host. Before we get started, our latest issue of Native American News is out. I'll pass that around. If you want to get this sent to your email, leave your email with us at the front desk today. We're glad to get that to you. Before I introduce our speaker for today, on Friday, April 26th, our next Lunch and Learn will be by Dr. Christopher Moore of the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at USC. This topic is blood residue analysis of Paleo-American stone tools in the Carolinas. He's extracting microscopic hemoglobin embedded in stone tools and figuring out what animal it killed or butchered, which is really incredible stuff. So that's Friday, April 26th. Today, I'm pleased to announce a new colleague of ours, Professor Deborah Rowell. She's working on her PhD in criminal justice at Liberty University, expects to graduate soon and enter tenure track here at USC Lancaster. She has a master's in criminal justice with a concentration in law enforcement administration from USC, and she has a BS degree in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. She's done a lot of different things. She's worked in law enforcement career in the school district here in Lancaster. Evidence technician for the FBI. That is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I think that's really cool. It's got lots of awards for this from the Association of Career and Technology Educators. First Beginning Teacher Award, Teacher of the Year several times in the district. And she teaches or is approved to teach, I guess. Since she just started, you probably don't teach all of these, but American Criminal Justice System, Research Methods in Criminology and Criminal Justice, courses in Ethics, Policing, Corrections, Criminal Courts, and Criminal Law. And so without further ado, I'll give you Debbie Rowell, how DNA technology can reveal identity, ancestry, and appearance in forensic science. Make welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I can actually skip through my first slide then because I just kind of told a little bit about me, but I'm really honored to be here today to talk to you guys. This presentation, I am not a scientist. I'm criminal justice. I will defer to my science colleagues that I have here with me for a lot of the scientific questions. A lot of the scientific stuff that's done is just research from a personal interest of mine. I will never forget when I was an 11th grade student in high school, my AP biology teacher and my AP chemistry teacher got together and they were just bouncing down the hall. They were so excited about something. And we didn't know what was going on. And they had just gotten this brand new thing called an electrophoresis machine. And they wanted to show us. And they were just going on and on about how wonderful it was. This is in 1990. We had no idea what we were seeing. We had no idea where this was going to go. We had no idea why our professors, our teachers were acting the way they were acting. Because we're like, what on earth why are they so excited? And thinking just in this short amount of time, how DNA technology has evolved and the things that we're seeing that DNA is able to do. It's amazing to me. And I'm glad to be able to share this with you as we go. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about some innovations in forensic science, kind of how forensic science evolved. I'm going to show you a timeline. In the interest of time, I'm not going to get into that too much, but just to show you how quickly the process of DNA has evolved. We're going to talk about DNA evidence and what's admissible as evidence, what the courts have ruled with when you can use a particular technique for DNA, just to kind of let you see how far we've come in the process from RFLP to now something called touch DNA. We're going to talk about ancestry databases. A lot of my presentation is going to focus on ancestry databases. People either really, really love those or are really terrified of them. And we're going to talk about why you don't really need to be terrified of them because I did some research using my own family, which was really, really interesting. But we're going to talk about what their policies are with releasing information and some of the unique information that I found that actually led me to do more research. And then we're going to talk about modern DNA technology, and we're going to talk about where this technology is going with policing and what police are using this for. And at the end, we're going to talk about some stuff that you can use this modern technology for that's actually kind of neat. I really don't need to talk about myself because that's already been done. So let's go ahead and get started with this. In the 3rd century, you think DNA is new, and DNA itself is new. Forensic science is not new. The ancient Chinese knew a lot about a lot. And they studied, and they had coroners. And even in ancient China, coroners used pigs to try to figure out how murders happened. Even today, when we're trying to research different things and how they impact humans, we use pigs because pigs are probably the closest that we can get to human flesh when we're doing different kinds of experiments. So in the 3rd century, we have this collection of criminal cases that talk about different types of murders, and they would use the information that they got to go to the suspect and get a confession. And then in the 7th century, the Chinese realized that fingerprints were unique. So they started using like their fingerprint to sign sculptures. And when they would make bricks and things like that, they would put their thumbprints in it so that people would know that who had made that particular thing. In 1248, we had this wonderful case. Sun Tzu wrote The Washing Away of Wrongs. And this is the first time that we have a medico-criminal entomological investigation. That's a lot of big words there. Basically, we use bugs to find out who committed a crime. There was a murder, and the murder had been committed with a scythe, one of the farming implements. So Sun Tzu had all of the farmers bring their scythes and lay them out in the town square. And within just a couple of moments, flies came to one side because the scythe had blood on it, and the flies were attracted. The person confessed, the murder was solved. Boom, forensic science. I love it. It's just great. I really enjoy it just because it's evolving so quickly. As you can see here, the origin of the species in 1859, and then we started isolating DNA in 1869, all the way down the first genetic map and the first human criminal convictions were in 1987. You know, we think about that, and a lot of people since 1987, I'm going to talk about the Innocence Project a little bit later on, but a lot of people that were put in prison that were wrongfully convicted due to DNA evidence have now been released because it is a very new science. Before this, we used blood typing. And then we had started with scientific databases. CODIS is our DNA database where we store DNA evidence. Now, one thing about DNA, if you watch a lot of these shows on TV, everybody watches CSI and all this. So we have what we call the CSI effect, where we expect crimes to be solved in 30 minutes and wrapped up all nice and neat. That very rarely happens. DNA is fabulous if you have something to compare it to. Just like a fingerprint. You can have 40 fingerprints on a crime scene. If your person that left those fingerprints has no criminal record, you're going to run them through a database and you're going to get nothing. It's the same thing with DNA, and we have to remember that. But there are ways we can use DNA that we can't use fingerprints. We may not have your DNA, but we may have your mama's. We may have your dad's, and we may be able to do something to link you as a relative. So DNA does have some advantages there. And all the way up 2004 was when the first suspect was identified in CODIS, and we've just exploded in technology since then. So let's take a look at DNA evidence, excuse me, and admissibility in court. The first court case to actually discuss this was Fry, and the Dauber and Fry cases are the cases that we study in forensics when we talk about admissibility of evidence. Fry case was actually, it was a systolic blood pressure test, lie detector test. And expert witness testified about the results of this. And the testimony was not allowed because at the time the technique did not have what we call general scientific acceptance. So the court said, no, it's got to be something that the scientific community recognizes as being legitimate in order to be able to use it in the court. That's why to this day we're able to use things like forgery detection with handwriting, but not graphology. Graphology is the people that say, oh, the person that wrote this note was angry. That's not an accepted science. But using it and say, oh, this person made this letter D the exact same way that this letter D was written on this check. So we may have something that's a similarity. That's accepted as science. Okay, so that's the difference. Now, in 1975, the federal rules of evidence came out and said that the courts basically are the ones responsible for determining if evidence is acceptable. What we use now, the big thing that we use is the Dauber case, okay? Dauber versus Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals said that this is where they published studies indicating the use of drugs while you were pregnant did not lead to birth defects. And we know that now that that's not true, that there are a lot of drugs that do cause birth defects here. So what the court ruled in this case was that the federal rules of evidence supersede Fry. So the courts make the determination as to whether or not evidence is admissible. And basically what we don't look at, studies on animals, unpublished studies. I mean, anybody can do research, but if it's not published and peer reviewed, it can be anything. It can say anything. You can manipulate data. One of the things I teach in research methods is any data can be manipulated. So it's got to be accepted in the scientific community, and it's got to be something that the courts rule is admissible, and it's got to be published, peer reviewed, etc. Okay, now this is just a quick thing. This is very technical, so I'm not going to get into this very deeply. But when we first started off with DNA, we had what we call the RFLP process. You had to take DNA, do electrophoresis. It required a lot of DNA under very specific conditions. It was very easy for DNA to degrade if it wasn't stored properly, if it wasn't collected properly. So you needed to have a very large sample. So then we kind of evolved into the short tandem repeat where you could make copies of DNA. And then we went to PCR and then to mitochondrial. Now, mitochondrial DNA is fascinating because you get half of your DNA from your mom, half your DNA from your dad. Okay, well, this is one of those things, and we used this a lot in my old job in law enforcement when we didn't have a body, but we knew that we had a suspected person, that we had a victim. This is an example of a case. We had a particular amount of blood evidence, and we had a person that we thought might be our victim, but we didn't have the body. We just had a lot of blood. So we took the blood, ran it through the DNA database, nothing in CODIS. But we went to our suspected victim's mother and said, would you be willing to provide us with a blood sample? And of course, she was willing to provide us with a blood sample. So we took the blood sample. Now, we couldn't say that the DNA was this person, but what we were able to say was the DNA, the blood belonged to a child of this woman. And so that's how we were able to use mitochondrial DNA. Now, we only need 7 or 8 cells. We do a thing in our class with the show that's on Discovery Channel called Killing Fields. It ran a few years ago. I'm friends with the detectives that actually were on that show. So watching that show and using that show in class, the detectives interact with my students. And they had an episode where they wanted to get a suspect. They couldn't get him to provide DNA. He wasn't going to provide DNA. So they followed him to the grocery store, which was a public place, watched him go inside the grocery store, went over to his car and swabbed his door handle. Okay? Public place, no expectation of privacy there on the outside of the door handle, got DNA. Now it's amazing how we've come from needing this huge sample to being able to swab a door, touch DNA. I can't wait to see where this is going to go in the future. It's just absolutely fascinating to me. Law enforcement is able to use this, but this is not cheap. One of the reasons that these detectives were able to do a lot of the things they were able to do is because Discovery Channel gave them the money to be able to shoot this TV show. They gave them technology that the average police department doesn't have. But it was really, really cool. And it gives a highly specific DNA profile. We're starting to find that. Now we're using these DNA databases a lot. And everybody's like, well, if I give my sample to 23andMe or if I give my sample to Ancestry, is the government going to get it? The answer is no. Okay, not without a warrant. And you see here, I've got the requirements for compliance with law enforcement. You can't confirm identity on these DNA databases. Anybody can say they're anybody and send a sample in for DNA. So because you can't confirm that again, remember your scientifically accepted samples here. So if you want to search 23andMe, you have to have a warrant. You send the warrant to 23andMe. 23andMe notifies the person, hey, the police have just given us a warrant. Do you consent? And if the person says yes, they'll give you the information. If the person says no, they're like, too bad. Ancestry will not grant law enforcement access to the database for human remains and identification, anything, unless there's a warrant. And again, advance notice is required. And you see here, this was some data. They do transparency reports. 23andMe had received 11 data requests, and the information that they were able to provide wasn't, they didn't provide a lot of different information. Here, Ancestry got 5 requests from the United States, 4 from state law enforcement, 1 from federal. And they were requests for non-DNA customer data, and they didn't provide the information. So your data is secure when you submit to these different sites. And these sites can, a lot of times there's other databases that collect information too, like that aren't as secure as these, or that are government databases that can be used if necessary. Now, here's an interesting thing. This is what your DNA can tell you about a person. This is mine. This is mine from 23andMe. And the DNA sample says that I am 97.0% European, 73.6% British and Irish, which you could probably tell by looking at me, that I am definitely British and Irish. I do have a little French and German. You see how deeply it goes into percentages though. Now these numbers are kind of small, but it breaks it down and it does talk about diversity. And interestingly enough, since I submitted my stuff to 23andMe several years ago, my genetic profile has changed 3 times. Every time they get more information, they update the information. So they update your ancestry. So they update what you have. Now, what else can this tell you about me? Okay, well, this is a comparison. So we'll go back and it says, this one says that I am 73.6% British and Irish. Okay, Ancestry.com says, yeah, I'm 50% English, 15% Scottish, and 12% Irish. Okay, but this one goes even further and it traces immigration patterns. And it says, oh, you have DNA that matches settlers in Alabama that came during a specific time period. Or you have DNA from the southern backcountry, Oklahoma and Texas. And I didn't pull all of them, but it actually tells you the time frames that these people traveled according to your DNA. 23andMe does it a little bit differently, but it still gives years and time frames of what time frame the DNA was most prevalent. And you can see if you're going from Middle East, Eastern European, Greek, Scandinavia, and into England, which is fascinating to me. Now, other things it tells you. It says that I have blue eyes with a little bit of green in them, very fair skin. I do not have red hair. I'm more likely to have dark brown hair. Okay. Tells me that I am likely to drink a lot more coffee than the average person. Those of you that know me well. Yes, I do. I have light eyes. My ring finger is longer than my index finger. I am introverted, believe it or not. I am when I'm not teaching. I am introverted. I hide it well. I am a morning person because I get tired very easily now. I like to take naps, hence the morning person. I do not like taking risks, and I do not. My skin pigmentation is a little bit lighter. All of that was probabilities from my DNA. But the coolest one said that my DNA suggests that I have brown hair, but that I could have a redheaded child. This is my daughter. And get much redder than that hair. So, but an interesting thing, my husband and I both ran our DNA on this and got our DNA profiles. And then we got Emily's and we said, hey, Em, let's do your profile too. Let's just see what it does with percentages and what it pulls together. We got a message that Emily's DNA could not be extracted. And it was interesting to me. And I said, did we do something wrong? They said, we'll send you another kit, try again, no problem. So I got on the chat box and this is where the fascinating thing happened. I started chatting with the person on the other end about why we couldn't get Emily's DNA. And the person on the other end said, probably her epilepsy medication. I had never told that my daughter had epilepsy. I said, how did you know she had epilepsy? Well, you can't extract her DNA. There are epilepsy medications that you can't extract the DNA and can't process it properly. So, and that has done, I've done some research on that for obvious reasons. I'm not going to talk about medications that you can use to alter your DNA. You know, I don't think we have anybody in the audience that could take advantage of that, but, you know, legal liability and stuff, I really like my new job, so we're just gonna leave that where it is. But it was fascinating to me that was one of the things that they found. Um, Now, here's the ethical considerations with these DNA databases. There's a lot of things that you've got to think about here. First of all, anything in the computer can be hacked, can be stolen. Okay? Is the information being secured? Is the database being protected? Hackers are everywhere, and if hackers can get into the Pentagon, hackers can probably get into a DNA database. Okay, so that's something that you have to think about. You also have to think about legality and constitutionality here. There are some countries that mandate DNA collection at the time of arrest. Now, if you think about that, arrest, we in the United States believe very strongly in innocent until proven guilty. So a lot of times we will take DNA from certain people when they are convicted of crimes, but not when they're arrested. Okay, but some countries do. The data remains even if the person's not convicted. And we're finding a lot of the data that is collected, there's a socioeconomic disparity in the people that data is being collected from, which leads to a lot of questions. It's one of those things where, you know, there's always this argument, should we take DNA? Should we collect it? The question always remains, when you collect it, where do you store it? And what do you use it for? And when it comes to our indigenous populations, that's a very big deal. When it comes to Native American populations and other indigenous populations, there have been times in history where blood and other samples were collected without consent and used without consent. And that's a big thing. We don't think about it the same way, but if you've got an indigenous person who all of a sudden one of their ancestors is dug up from somewhere and put behind a glass case for people to see, and tests are run on their remains and all of this, you've got to protect the tribal autonomy. You've got to protect religious autonomy, cultural autonomy. There's a lot to be said for that when you're dealing with indigenous populations. You need to collaborate with Native researchers when that happens, instead of just going in and just collecting. There was a really good article that I read from a Native American out in South Dakota who had experienced that. Her great-grandfather was a tribal chief in South Dakota, and they found his remains and nobody knew, and then he was just dug up and put in a museum and displayed. The family tried to get the remains back, couldn't get the remains back. There's a lot of people trying to use this information to claim Native American ancestry, to get tribal benefits, to get tribal recognition. So there's a lot of cultural sensitivity that you just got to be cognizant of when you're doing something like this. And I think she said that like his remains, they didn't want to return his remains because they claimed that he was the leader of an uprising, a Native American uprising. And so that's why they didn't want to give the remains back. And it was a big mess. And so you've got to respect these beliefs when you're dealing with people in different populations. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road with modern DNA technology. Parabon Nanolabs is phenomenal with what they're doing with DNA. They do nanotech, they do forensics, analytics, genetic genealogy. The police officers in the TV show that I told you about, Killing Fields, they're the ones that actually told me about this. And I did some research to see what I could find. And it is fascinating to me. Let's say that you have DNA from a suspect. Again, remember, you don't have anything to compare it to, so you don't have a person. Okay? Well, you saw all the stuff that they were able to do with my DNA and Ancestry.com. Well, Parabon does phenotyping just like that, and they can provide you with a composite sketch of a person from their DNA. This is the predicted suspect, and that's his mugshot. They can also do it with victims. They had remains. They weren't able to identify the remains, so they did a DNA phenotype. Ancestry, they provided this report. They circulated this report, and this young woman's family was able to identify her and claim her remains. And here's another example of a predicted person and the actual photo of the person. When they practiced this, they ran it for a long time with a lot of people that they knew to get it to see if it would work. You see, because you've got predictions here, so you can take the computer and you can say, well, let's make them have a little bit different hair color, or let's make them have a slightly different eye color. Let's manipulate it just a little bit, and you can send out different pictures. Another thing that you can do with it is you can age progress it. This was the art enhancement. Now, forensic artistry, you've got the people that did sketches for years, and computers have replaced that because you can do this aging now. So this was an example. They took the DNA and they said, okay, if they're this age, they're going to look like this, and progress them on from the age of 25 to the age of 75. Here's their actual suspect. So it's pretty accurate. And I can only imagine as technology increases, how the accuracy of this is going to increase. And the things that you can use this for. In the show that we watched, the young woman had been missing for 13 years. They had a suspect in mind, but when they ran the DNA, they found that the DNA on the victim belonged to a Hispanic person. At the time that the murder was committed, the Hispanic population of that town was 0.15%. So that narrowed down the suspect pool considerably, but a lot can happen within 13 years. And sadly, even though they do have this profile, the case still hasn't been solved. They're still covering leads on the case. So, again, we like to think that we can wrap up these cases all nice and neat. That's where TV is very deceptive. TV leads you to believe they always get solved, and a lot of times they don't. But we're a lot better than we were. Now, they also do this thing, and I pulled this right off their website to show how they can do kinship inferences. Are these two people related? And they can look, and if you do Ancestry or 23andMe, it will say, oh, you have DNA relatives. You have a fourth cousin, and it'll pop it up. And you can say, is it on your mom's side or on your dad's side? And you can look into those and make connections if you choose to. And that's a neat thing that you can do as well. Being adopted, I have found, I know my birth mother's name. I've met my birth mother once before she passed away. Never knew anything about my birth father, but I've already had my birth mother's name, and several interesting, like, last name has popped up, and other names that I remember from the conversation that I had with her. So it has matched us, even though my family tree that I have in Ancestry is my adopted family, because that's my family tree. My DNA family tree is different. Our son's DNA family tree is different because he's adopted. He was adopted at birth. He got a DNA hit within 5 minutes on his maternal grandmother. And he asked me a question, and I said, yeah. I said, here, I'll show you a picture of her. But I mean, it took 5 minutes. So, there's things that you can find relatives, you can find twins, all kinds of statistics for this. Now, why do we need this? Look at the statistic from the Department of Justice. Over 60% of all violent crimes, the victim knows the offender. So if there's some kind of kinship or something, we always start with the people closest to the victim and work our way out. So this is how we can use kinship inferences as well. And facial reconstruction. I remember the days of I love doing this on the skull with the clay. It's so relaxing. You take these little depth markers. We have these certain tissue depth, different places on our face. So if you take a human skull and you just have the skull and you put the depth markers on there and you smooth this clay all over it, you get a picture of what the person looks like. It's very neat process, takes a long time. Now we just scan the skull into the computer and let the computer do it for us. And it's eerily accurate. And this is another thing that Parabon does. They use your DNA because different people might have different facial thicknesses. We know that different skull, there's different types of skull characteristics for different races. Males and females have different skull characteristics. So it takes all of this information and puts it in there with what it knows. And then it comes up with probabilities of what a person looks like. You see here the facial reconstruction of this person to be able to find a missing person. And they can manipulate it different ways, different hairstyles and stuff like that to find what your person looks like. Now, I told you about the Innocence Project. This is another DNA technology that we have, started in 1992. Their goal is to re-examine people who have been convicted. They look at DNA and they free people that have been wrongfully convicted. Do they free everybody? No. Sometimes the DNA comes back. That's exactly the person who committed the crime. But sometimes it doesn't. And there's nothing more satisfying, I think. And you feel bad for the person because they've been in prison. My students research Innocence Project. That's one of their projects they do in class. And you'll hear them talking about, my person was locked up for 35 years. My person was locked up for 27 years. And they're talking about this stuff, and the person was innocent. And because of DNA, we're able to get people out of prison that shouldn't be in prison. It's an expensive process. It's a tedious process. It's something I encourage young people, if you want to be in science and you're interested in something, every state has the Innocence Project. You can look them up. You can volunteer for them. You can reach out. They work with a lot of volunteers. So it's a good way to get experience. And that's what I tell my kids. If you're looking for something where you can get some real world experience, I mean, I'm sure they could use some young people to do some research for them anytime. So, reach out. And what I tell my students when I'm looking at stuff like that, the worst anybody can ever tell you is no. And so far, I haven't had anybody tell me no when I've reached out and asked these questions about trying to help. Now, the last one, where we're going in the future. Pet DNA. You ever wondered what your critter really was? This is a new thing, okay? And I did this just for this presentation. My 3 little pound puppies were guinea pigs for y'all. And I did them through 2 different databases. I did one through Ancestry.com. There's like 1,000, dog DNA is like the big thing. You Google dog DNA, all these different companies will come up. But I did Wisdom Panel for 2 of them because they were on sale. And then I did one on Ancestry. Now the first one is my dog Baxter, okay? Here's what Baxter's DNA tells you about Baxter. Baxter's genes say that he's got short fur, that he's fawn, recessive red, and tan. He's got a short snout. He doesn't shed much. He's about 7 to 13 pounds. So he's 89% Chihuahua, 1% Rat Terrier, 1% Mini Pin, 1% Dachshund, 3% Pekingese, 2% Cocker Spaniel, 1% Boston Terrier, because 2% Chow. How on earth one of these is not like the other? Okay, I was looking at that and I went, which one? Whoa. They said he's got short little stubby legs. He probably has short fur that's straight, and he has brown or amber eyes. Okay, and you picture from what the DNA tells me, can you picture what Baxter looks like? Is that what Baxter looked like? His DNA says this is what he looks like. I'm still trying to figure out the cha-cha. But I think that's why he thinks he's the biggest, baddest dog on the block. I really do. I think that Chow gene in him's like, but he's like got legs like this, literally. When he walks, you go, I don't know how he gets there. Because he's little stubby legs. Okay. But he just, that's Baxter. And then there's my heart. There's little Dougal. Okay. Dougal, they said, didn't shed much, shed a little bit, was predominantly black with a little bit of fawn, mask, like maybe a dark muzzle, a little bit, maybe red, maybe some tan points, 29% West Highland White, 27% miniature Schnauzer, eat them mud, 25% Chihuahua, 2% Scottish Terrier, 1% Cairn Terrier, Shih Tzu, Pekingese, Beagle, and Collie. You see, he's got a little facial beard. The furnishings mean like little beard structures and stuff. Ears upright, about 13 to 20 pounds. And then brown or amber eyes, little bit of red, maybe a little white to yellow coat shades, and long, possibly long hair. Can you picture Dougie in your mind? I would have never guessed West Highland White. When we got him, I thought he was Cairn Terrier. But West Highland White is the predominant breed, but he's got all these little colors in his coat, just like they said he would. It's really interesting. Now, the one thing about Wisdom Panel, they didn't tell a lot about personality, which was interesting. So it's kind of like, I mean, because if you're an animal lover, your animals all have very distinct personalities. Well, Ancestry does. Ancestry said my third little booger is a miniature American Shepherd. Now, the person that, when we got him, said that he was miniature Australian Shepherd and maybe Beagle, but she wasn't sure. And the DNA confirmed miniature American Shepherd, which is what they call miniature Aussies, because only Americans like to shrink dogs down. And so if it's a dog from another country and they shrink them down, it's not an Australian Shepherd anymore now, it's an American Shepherd. Okay, so you've got this little American Shepherd and Beagle mix. They say that he's not fearful of grooming, but that he is has a lot of separation anxiety, and this is the clingiest dog on the planet. That in stranger danger, that he gets aggressive around dogs. He's like, he gets when he doesn't know people, and he does. He doesn't have social anxiety. Not afraid of loud noises. Doesn't snap at dogs. It didn't say anything about cats. He hates cats. But he shares his toys, like it says, DNA says. Physically, it says that he's got like maybe a darker coat. This one wasn't as accurate. Brown coat possible. He didn't have blue eyes. His coat's straight. Says his ears are upright. Not really furry facial features, but short hair. Average size with a patterned coat. Long tail. White fur. Now this one was inaccurate because it said white fur not present. But you see what it looks for in the dog. Okay. Charlie is a different creature. Okay. But his DNA gave me a little bit of information about it, but not a lot. Okay. So I found that one was a little bit different, but like I said, this is new. And just like when DNA with humans was new, there's a lot of room for error here as you're learning and growing and changing. So it's going to be interesting to see how this changes. I don't think they do cat DNA yet. They may. Good luck getting DNA from a cat. It's probably like giving a cat a pill because literally you have to like swab their cheek. And I thought the Chihuahua and I were going to battle over this. I'm like, you have got to be still. I've got to do the presentation. And he was not having part of this. I can't imagine swabbing a cat for DNA. But if they do it, I'll try it. We'll see. I'm willing to science. I'm willing to do it. But it'll be interesting to see how this is evolving and how you can use this as well. Because there have been dog hairs that have been used to solve crime scenes. There's a couple of really good episodes of Forensic Files. One of them involves a woman who was murdered, and she had a very specific breed of dog. And they found it was a very unique dog, and they found dog hairs on their suspect that actually led them to see that he had interacted at that scene. Now, again, that doesn't prove that he killed her, but it proves that he was somewhere interacting with her, and probability of him like being in a casual interaction with her was not likely. And so they took that information and moved further and were able to actually solve a murder using dog hair. And that was before we even had pet DNA. Now, this DNA can tell you dog relatives. So can we use this later? What are the implications for this going forward? We don't know. That's the cool thing about science. It changes every day. And so 10 years from now, may give a talk on this again. Goodness knows what we'll be using this DNA for. But I just wanted to give you a little overview of how quickly it's evolved and how much is out there and what the possibilities are.